I've been doing work now on the whole Asian Pacific War. This was a totally horrendous event from 1937 to 1945. By my best estimate, something on the order of 25 million human beings died. About 6 million of them were combatants, about 3 million Chinese, about 2 million Japanese. That means the other 19 million were non-combatants. Casualties among Japanese non-combatants, you can find various figures between in excess of 600,000 to my highest estimate is about 1.2 million. If you round it and call it a million, that means basically that for every Japanese non-combatant who died, about 18 other non-combatants died. About 12 of them were Chinese. And we heard very movingly and very appropriately last night from 2 survivors of the atomic bombings. And I believe it's extraordinarily important that we always keep in mind the horrendous nature of those weapons that hangs over us to this day. But to me, you have to understand just how utterly god-awful the war was, how utterly awful the daily toll was. Over 5,000 Chinese were dying every single day the war continued. It's been estimated that 250,000 people were dying every month, mostly Asian non-combatants. This is the context in which all of this takes place. This is the context in which we now can sit back and make judgments. Thank you.
I'd like to focus on whether there was any decision at all, whether the word decision is the appropriate word to describe what happened, and concerns the timing of the bombing and the role of General Leslie Groves, not surprisingly since I wrote a whole book about him and his role in the bomb. And when you follow the actions of General Groves, I came to this realization that there was not really any decision by President Truman to authorize the use of the bomb. He acquiesced in the decision of others. He went with the momentum of events that culminated in the bomb's use, and only in retrospect did he, in interviews and in his memoir, did he put himself more decisively directing the use of the bomb in July and August of 1945. A website entitled "The Decision to Drop the Atomic Bomb," not one contains any language by Truman authorizing the use of the bomb before August 6th, an odd omission under that title. Of course, Truman was not totally ignorant of the bomb when he became president in August 12th, upon FDR's death. And he was told soon after by Secretary of War Stimson and General Groves the details of the bomb. And according to General Groves, the only decision that Truman really made about the bomb was not to interfere with ongoing plans. The momentum of the project was extraordinary at that point. All engineered by General Groves, I think, I try and show. And when there was enough material, fissile material, both highly enriched uranium and plutonium, when there was enough available, the bombs would be used, period. There's no doubt about that. Another question is, what if the war had not been over in Europe? Would the bomb have been used in Europe? The war was over, of course, on May 8th. That was too soon for the bombs being ready, and the question was never focused on whether it would have been used in Europe. So Truman was in an odd place when he inherited the presidency. And as Bill mentioned here, he went with the continuity of things that had already been put in place. The continuity being that Stimson and Marshall, 2 people that Truman had the utmost respect for, better to go along with what is already in place than make the contrary decision. So, as General Groves says, Truman's decision was not so much as to say yes as to say no. It would have taken an enormous effort to say no. We're not going to use the bomb. We're going to go some alternate route. And with the people surrounding him and the plans already in place and the momentum underway, it was just not in the cards that Truman would do anything else but go along with what had already been put in place. What he did do was interject himself into stopping the use of the bomb. As was mentioned before, once some peace feelers began to be heard from Japan after the Nagasaki bomb, Truman interjected himself and said, "No more," and General Marshall told General Groves, "No more bombs are to be taken to Tinian except upon authorization from President Truman." It's a dangerous occupation, but sometimes it's useful. And it is, I think, in this case, useful to consider what would have happened had the bomb not been used in the early days of August 6th and August 9th. It was mentioned that on August 8th, the Soviet Union entered the war, and this has become, according to one scholar's argument, a action that had more impact on the Japanese than the dropping of the atomic bomb and ending the war. I don't buy it, but anyway, the Japanese had to consider August 6th, Hiroshima, August 8th, the Soviets entered the war, August 9th, Nagasaki. I mean, what's going on here? And they did something about it, and they surrendered, and it stopped the whole thing.
Why did we have to drop two? I mean, if it were about really ending the war and not just making a test of these two bombs that were developed. Thank you.
I guess this is aimed at me. Again, it was General Groves who was in charge of establishing what was called a target committee. This was done in April. The first time they met was April 27th. Groves, a master bureaucrat, he says, I have nothing against the committee as long as I get to choose the members. So, so he chose the members, and they were a collection of military people and Oppenheimer and scientists and the Army, Air Forces, and so on and so forth. And they decided that they would spare any city that hadn't already been bombed. They wanted really a fresh look at an unbombed city to show the power of the bomb. I mean, that was the intent of why some of these targets were chosen. Groves was obsessed with trying to get Kyoto on the target list, and Stimson, who had visited Japan, I think twice, knew its historic and cultural import to the Japanese and vetoed them again and again and again. Groves was obsessed with trying to get Kyoto on, but it didn't happen. And thus, the target list became Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kokura, and Nagata. I think those were the four at the end of the target committee's deliberations. I think, they didn't know whether this was going to work or not. They were sure about the Little Boy bomb.
Lived under the cloud of for some 70 years. General Groves and others also saw the use of the bombs against cities as essentially a bluff. It was a bluff to prove that we had not merely one bomb, but that we had an arsenal of bombs. And what this ultimately would lead Japanese decision makers to realize was, as Premier Suzuki would say in December 45, if the Americans have such weapons in quantity, then they will not come and invade Japan. And if they do not invade Japan, Japan's military leaders had no strategy short of national suicide.
That span of time from the 9th to the 17th, to get it all titanium and ready to use. So the third bomb was scheduled for August 17th. They might have gained a day or two, but that was the timetable. And many more after that. I mean, Groves had them lined up, September, October, November. He would have upwards of 20 by the end of December. So already the assembly line was open, and plutonium was coming from the Hanford reactors in huge amounts at that point, and you could calculate all of these things. We needed this much. And
I would just add a couple of points. When we sit in our location today, we often wish that things had sort of worked out differently, had occurred differently, etc. But of course, what drove the Manhattan Project initially was a fear that Hitler and the Nazis were going to develop an atomic bomb. You would wish, in retrospect, everyone was just a good person and we decided not to pursue such technology. But I believe it was a responsible decision on the part of the Americans, and the British, of course, were already engaged in Club Alois research, etc., because they feared what the world would be if Adolf Hitler was the first person to possess atomic weapons. So you understand what sort of drives the decision-making, and then a sort of organizational genius like Groves pushes it, the remarkable industrial capability of the United States pursues it. I don't dispute for a moment some of the unfortunate consequences of the American possession of atomic weapons, etc. And yet I think we should mention that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the only times when weapons were used in warfare. And perhaps in a terrible way, they gave us an example of the awful consequences of these weapons, such that statesmen on all sides in the Cold War have held back because they know of the awfulness of these weapons, and that they play at least some part in that regard. So I concede that there are all kinds of issues that bubble forth from nuclear weapons. For myself, however, I would have to say that during the Cold War, I'm glad the United States didn't engage in any sort of unilateral disarmament. By and large, I think deterrence worked, and the Soviet Union was a threat to the United States, and they were held at bay by the nuclear balance.
was there any cooperation or collusion between German or the Axis powers to develop the bomb? And do we know how and where and when they would have used this weapon?
Groves was obsessed. He created a team called the Alsos team, which is a group of soldiers and scientists who were at the leading edge of the invasion of Europe, first in Italy and then later in D-Day, to find out really what was going on. By about October 1944, October-November, this Alsos, A-L-S-O-S, Alsos team has found out that the German program was not going anywhere. There's no fear of the bomb. But nevertheless, that didn't cause the American effort to go any slower. In fact, it was racing along at an extraordinary pitch. This began an explanation that the German scientists used after the war, very tricky here, and it was almost immediately decided by Heisenberg and the others that they would take the position that they knew how to make a bomb, but they didn't want Hitler because he's a nutcase and a madman, so we won't give it to him. Now, the German scientists argued this for many years, and I think it's totally fallacious. I mean, first of all, I don't think they knew how. I mean, they never investigated enough to know how to make a bomb and organize themselves into making one. They could have done it. I mean, anybody can do it. And as we know in the history of what has happened over the past 70 years, many other countries have successfully done it. Every country that set out to make one, made one. And they're still doing it. I mean, Iran's going to get a bomb. There's no doubt about it, one of these days. And only one of the countries, South Africa, has willingly given it up. But that's another whole story. But anyway, the German scientists rested on this argument that, oh yeah, we know how to do it. But we didn't want Hitler to know that. So we were the dissidents in the thing. I think this is baloney. But anyway, there are a lot of books written about this. And General Groves, he listening in on these farm hall transcripts, which finally became declassified. They're in our archives. He got the first copy all the time. There are multiple copies, and they're fascinating reading about the state of the German bomb program, which was going nowhere. But anyway, that's how it ended up.
With respect to the Japanese, what you have to bear in mind, there's really two parts of an atomic bomb program. There's the science part, and so the basic idea was well known to any competent physicist in the world by, what, 1939?
Easy.
The tough part was the engineering, and that's where Japan simply did not have the resources to advance an atomic bomb program beyond a very low-level experimental stage. Now, that said, in addition to all the trees that died needlessly on this theory that the German scientists, for moral reasons, didn't make a bomb, there's actually been books published that claim the Japanese program had advanced so far as to, even I think in one case, claiming there was a test of a Japanese atomic bomb in August of 45 in Korea, or some such
nonsense.
Nonsense, yeah. Thank you for that. Very helpful. And that accurate scientific term that we needed at this moment. But but once again, I come back to the point. Remember, though, from at least the third quarter of 44, the idea about an atomic bomb program, the potential importance of an atomic bomb was well known in the top levels of Japanese leadership, including General Dojo, who's on record on that point. So they understood the idea of an atomic bomb. They just questioned, like the Germans, whether anybody else could do it.
Avoid extreme tactics to bring nations and city-states to their knees. We appropriately decry such events as the warfare of Genghis Khan as atrocities, but popular culture seems intent on venerating these individuals and their efforts. While this is most often seen in light of imperialism and not defense, it might appear that that same cultural mindset is at work here. Looking forward, in light of that, should we view Mr. Truman's decision as more akin to the philosophy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, where you must do what your conscience demands in faith, even if the act seems or is evil? Or does this signal maybe a more profound disconnect in our thinking that precludes us from finding the peace that we seek? Or to add a modifier to the question, do we have any more of a decision in whether or not we're a nuclear world than Mr. Truman did? Thank you.
Add here, I really think Bill really captures really accurately Mr. Truman's attitude, which is often glibly written off as, and I guess he's even on record as saying this, he never lost any sleep over the decision. Well, no, this is not what happened. His mind, his conscience really operated on two levels in his Bill cap. The one level was, did I make the best choice of the awful choices in front of me? I think he always felt that he had done the best choice that was presented to him at the time. Was he absolutely pain-stricken about the consequences of that decision for the rest of his life? I think the answer to that question is also emphatically yes. It was not something that he glibly regarded as simply one decision among many he made as president. He was tortured in many ways. When you read all the comments he makes later, it really leaps out.
And as I mentioned in my comments, interjected himself into stopping any further drop-ins of the bomb, which had been pre-delegated to Tinian, to General Groves, really, to keep using them until told to stop. And then they were told to stop, and they did.
Possible way of trying to end a war was a demonstration shot of the bomb, which was ruled as not an effective way to show the power of the bomb. And as Richard and others have mentioned, the value of the bomb was not its killing power necessarily. It was its shock value, to shock the Japanese leadership into surrender. And that was the purpose. And we have one final, and it will be a final question from a special questioner.
Thank you. I have a specific question, but before I talk about it, can I just express my general comment? As I listen to you people, I realize that you seem to share the similar view and perspective. And I was thinking that in this country, there are many other historians and other experts who do have very different viewpoints on the issue we're talking about. And I think it would be a great service to American citizens to have this kind of symposium staffed by the people with a different perspective. And not only American people, but I think there are a lot of Japanese historians, Japanese experts who have very different viewpoints. And in other parts of the world as well. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we can organize symposium of this nature? My specific question is this. I'm sure you all know that after the bombing, United States sent a B-29 with military personnel, scientists, medical scientists. The government wanted those experts to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, make the assessments of the quality of destruction, and to write a report back to the government. And you all know about what the report said. Perhaps many of the people in the audience don't know. What I understand is the report from that team was, yes, indeed, Japan was already beaten. Therefore, the use of atomic bomb was not needed. This is public knowledge. Anyway, today I thought it was interesting you didn't mention anything about the government's effort to make the assessment and what they said, what did the report said and how you react to that. And I thought it would have been useful for us to hear your comments on the government's reports. Thank you.
Thank you. What you're referring to is called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. And the specific report you're talking about is a summary report on the Pacific War. That report does, in fact, have a conclusion in it that says that Japan would have surrendered without the atomic bombings by November or December or some other such date. Since the time that that report has been published and has been used frequently in the debates about this, it has been subjected to scholarly study as to what was the basis for that report. It purportedly is based upon interviews with Japanese officials that support that conclusion. What the scholars found was when they went back to the actual documents relating to those interviews, the interviews did not support the conclusion. The fellow who was the principal draftsman of that is a guy named Paul Nitze, and we've now had at least 2 major scholarly works that have gone through and basically shredded Nitze's work on that point, indicating that he had another agenda in mind, which involved the further future of the U.S. Air Force or whatever here. So, once again, I can't say strongly enough how much empathy I have for you and fellow survivor and everyone else who was involved in that. It is enormous tragedy. As I've said, we should never forget about it and keep it in mind, and your testimony is important in that respect. But we've now plowed through this a very great deal. We've been through a lot of the debates back and forth or whatever here, and as Sam said, things may be heading more towards a middle ground, but the notion that Japan's leadership was on the cusp of surrender or could have easily been brought to surrender in 1945, even the more recent works I would put in the revisionist camp have backed away from making those kinds of assertions because the evidence is just not there. And that strategic bombing survey report in particular has been, in my view, pretty thoroughly trashed.
Yeah, just as the Germans, after the use of the bomb, made up a new story about their supposed role, many Americans did as well in terms of taking positions and saying things that were later used by the revisionists to say why the bomb shouldn't have been used, but they never did it. And Eisenhower is the best case. Yeah. He puts himself before Stimson saying, don't use the bomb. This never happened. This never happened. I mean, he just lied to his teeth. But, you know, you want to look good for posterity, so you do things like that. Now, we could go on. Admiral Leahy, there were many things said after the war about the bomb that were used, but no military figure said no to anyone in authority before the bomb was dropped, period. It's now shown up and down that that's the case. So, you know, you can't stop people from using these quotes, and the revisionists did, and they tried to make an argument which eventually, as Rich said, fell apart upon closer examination. And anyway, that's something to bear in mind in this whole discussion.
I think
Curiously enough, with respect to Admiral Leahy...
one final point.
One final point. The one thing that we do have documented that he said before the end of the war was that the bomb would not work. That's the one piece of advice he gave President Truman
Thank you.
before the bombs were used. They will not work. I'm an expert on explosives.
That's what Admiral Leahy said. That's what Admiral Leahy said to Truman. I'm an expert on explosives, and it won't work.
Thank you all. Thank you.